This anime it just hits you. It really does. You feel like you got socked in the face real hard after watching this. Just the fact that this is based off of a real life story makes it even more powerful, and it should be viewed as more than just a film or historical documentation. This is also, in a way, philosophical. It really is. And films usually use metaphors in order to discuss topics. Uh, but this is based off of a real life event, and it provides real life metaphors for us to use. Do the ends justify the means? What are human beings capable of? What aren't they capable of if they're able to do this to other human beings? It's just a sea of questions about human morality that are just being asked constantly. Who is good and who is bad? This is the thing about this movie. A lot of historical movies focus on one side and try to frame one side as being the total antagonists while the other side being the total protagonists. That's something that's normal when you're making a history film because, oh, you are allied to your own country, you believe in your own country, you have a side, you have an opinion. And as much as it's hard for some people to accept, everyone has their opinion, everyone is biased, and it's very hard to create a movie that isn't biased. But this movie doesn't have a protagonist, it doesn't have an antagonist. It's about survival, and it's about a experience of a little boy that saw hell on earth. And that's what makes this touching and so powerful. Just imagine the kids that survived this and what they had to see. It's it's really something that couldn't be explained with words. I could talk about this for 2 hours, and I wouldn't even touch an iota of what kids actually feel, and I wouldn't even be able to describe it. It's something else. But the philosophical questions and implications being asked, and the significance of this movie, that I could explain, and that is what I'm going to explain. This is the thing with the movie. They don't point at America and say, oh, they're the good guys. And they definitely don't point at the Japanese Imperial Army and say, oh, no, those are the good guys. They paint them both as being bad. And this is the thing. Wars are usually the scene in which, collateral damage takes place. It's always a fact that in war, the biggest victims are people that didn't have anything to do with it. You're not on one side or you're not on the other. You're just living your life, and all of a sudden, a bomb, a airplane raid comes by and you're dead, or your family dies and you survived to see your little brother, to see your little brother's corpse, or to see your father's corpse, or to see your little sister die. I mean, these. This is the thing. Many people will look at this and be like, okay, these are questions that were to be asked then, and they have no implications today because we have advanced. But really, have we? Have we really, as human beings? Think about this. I'm Middle Eastern, and my dad has a few business partners from Syria, and I remember asking one of them about his sons. I didn't directly know his sons, but I knew of them. And the response that was given to me was that they're in the army and they're on basically both armies, the rebel and uh, the Assad army. And this is something that's affecting people today. That poor guy that knows that his sons are on different sides of a war, and he's a victim because he has nothing to do with this. This is the same thing. You have this family that has nothing to do with the war. They're just Japanese, and they're stuck there. And this is the dirty side of war. And it's not just war we're talking about. We're talking about senseless killings as well. Air raids that take innocent lives. There's a genocide right now in Myanmar. There is. And nobody's talking about it because everyone cares about Kim Kardashian's butt cheeks more than they care about what happened in Hiroshima, the genocide in Myanmar, the suffering of the people in Yemen, people in Syria, people in Libya. People don't care about this. This is the sad truth. And when you contrast, what happens to what happens in our daily life, and us not paying attention to stuff like this, you'll realize this. We just don't care. And and this is the terrible truth about humanity. It's the same thing about with this guy that dropped the bomb. It's his job. He didn't care about the people he was about to kill. It was an assignment. He's gonna save his friends on the Allied side. You don't think about stuff like this, because if you do, you're gonna get overwhelmed all the time. But we really should entertain at least a little bit of thought when it comes to thinking about situations like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the situation in Myanmar. This movie does raise a lot of questions about not only war but also humanity. See how people treated one another after this incident happened. There were some that were scared to death of radiation and backed away from people that were their own siblings. And there were people that stood by and breastfed kids that might have died if that didn't happen. And it's not, this is the thing about this movie. It doesn't only show the parts of history that are well known from a Japanese standpoint or just an American standpoint. There are certain things about Japanese history that the Japanese are shy to discuss, like the fact that, food wasn't really that much so around in Hiroshima during that period of time, in which a lot of people were starving, a lot of people were struggling to get their rice. And you see this scene where a kid tells his mother, "Can I suck on the bones of the koi fish after you're done?" And this is powerful. Imagine yourself a mother and just been told by your son that your son wants to suck on the bones of a fish after you finish eating it. Just imagine that. Imagine how low you realize you are in the food chain that is society in Japan, in Hiroshima, before the bomb has dropped. So it's not all Cheerio. It's not all no, and it's not only this compared a critique of the Japanese side of history that isn't really being discussed. It's also a critique of the American side of history that isn't being discussed. And what I'm talking about here is the aerial bombings. And this is not something unique to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japanese cities before those two bombs were dropped. No. You see that in Vietnam, and you see that today. This is just the way things have always been, and nobody gives it a second thought. Have you just imagine this subject? There's no way of talking about this without feeling any semblance of emotion, to be honest. There really isn't. And it's really painful watching this over and no, watching this. It's painful, but it's necessary, because we have to remind ourselves we are human beings. We can't, and I don't mean to sound cliche, we can't go over to the dark side where everything is cold calculation. We need to think about the human heart. We have to think about people's emotions, because the second we start thinking of human beings as numbers on a sheet of paper, that's when we're not human anymore. And frankly, I think that's part of the message, is that we just think of the incident in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a numbers thing. Oh, this many people died. But what are the implications of those numbers? A life's death is it's something that is something priceless being taken away. And people stop thinking about it this way, that this many priceless things are dying, and instead they just look at the number. And we do get the figure of the number of people that died from the initial blast. We do. But we also get a figure of the people that die later. And we think of those people as just like, if we were just given those figures without seeing this movie, we'd be like, oh, cool beans. This many people died in Hiroshima. Okay. But after having the visual aspect of this movie being delivered to us, in which we see people being destroyed by the blast and reduced to almost skeleton-like figures. That scene where you see what looks like a zombie horde just walking by, and they're just people that have been severely injured due to radiation and the blast. It's something else. Really is. Because that number now has a different meaning to you're like, oh, so this many people had to suffer that fate. And frankly, this is a problem we have today. We look at news sources. Oh, there's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. There's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The people of Oman are malnourished. People in Libya and Sudan are malnourished and are facing a civil war. Those words are loose, but when you see people die, when you see people, face the same fate as the folk that faced that fate in Barefoot Gen, you start realizing that, oh, okay, and in today's society, it's almost impossible to escape this thought process of not thinking of people as individual people, rather as numbers, because look at how many wars we have going on right now. It really does take a toll on people. It really does. And again, looking at the movie and the two sides, the Imperial Japanese Army, the American Allied Army, looking at those two, you realize that there isn't really a good guy. And frankly, throughout history, as depressing as this may seem, that is almost always the case. People are always fighting for their own interests. Of course, there are protruding examples of people that are hell-bent on evil, like Hitler trying to eliminate almost all the Jewish population in Germany. But in a sense, the Americans have also committed acts that have killed innocent people, granted not as much as Hitler, and not in a systematic way. But still, you have to face the fact that in order to participate in something like a war, you have to abandon your humanity. And this is the thing about anime. There's a lot of great quotes that come out of anime in my perspective. And one of them is the ninth captain of the Gotei 13 in Bleach. And basically what he says is when war starts, both sides are evil. You have to abandon your humanity in order to go to war. And that's something we see in this movie. And the craziest thing about this movie is the fact that there was a childish tune throughout the whole thing. Because you saw it from the perspective of a kid. And you looked at things in a very childish way, as the kid does. Granted, the kid goes through a process of maturity as the bomb hits, and after the bomb hits, and after seeing death up close and personally. That does happen. But you see the movie, nonetheless, from the lens of a kid. So it's an interesting contrast to see this lack of humanity from the perspective of a child. And this child still acts childishly. And it's just something else. I mean, this movie tore my heart. This is Corazon levels of depression. Like that is the biggest. No, it's beyond that. It's very depressing. It's depressing for a good reason. It's a message. It's a historical, philosophical message to us not to abandon our humanity, and not to look at stuff like this as just a means to an end. Because ultimately, when you look at it, and that's sadly what this society today has, taught us. Numbers on a paper, not even human lives. It's Anime Gypsy. See you guys later. Bye.